Have you ever witnessed someone being severely underestimated only to witness them deliver the most satisfying comeback imaginable? 15 years ago, a brilliant young physicist named Theo Jackson presented groundbreaking research that could have changed quantum physics forever. But his work was stolen, his career derailed, and his dreams shattered. While the thief rose to academic stardom on stolen ideas, Theodore disappeared into obscurity, becoming a janitor at the very university where his intellectual property was being celebrated. For 15 years, he cleaned floors, emptied trash cans, and silently watched as Professor Lawrence Harrington, the man who stole his life's work, belittled students and claimed credit for breakthroughs he never earned. No one suspected that the quiet janitor mopping the halls held more knowledge in his mind than most of the faculty combined. But when an unsolvable quantum problem stumps the department's brightest minds, worlds collide. Harrington, desperate to maintain his fading reputation, catches Theo solving complex equations after hours and decides to publicly humiliate him. In front of the entire physics department, the arrogant professor dares the uneducated janitor to solve an impossible equation, threatening his livelihood if he fails. What happens next will send shockwaves through the academic world. Because sometimes, karma takes 15 years to arrive, but when it does, it solves quantum equations in 12 minutes flat. The hallways of Westfield University's physics department were always quiet on Friday evenings. Most students and faculty rushed out to begin their weekends, leaving the polished floors empty except for the rhythmic squeaking of Theo Jackson's mop. At 42, Theo had been the department's janitor for 15 years. His presence was as much a fixture of the building as the worn marble busts of Newton and Einstein that lined the entrance hall. Most days, Theo was practically invisible to the brilliant minds that filled these halls, just another shadow moving along the periphery. But not tonight. Absolutely unacceptable. The thundering voice of Professor Lawrence Harrington echoed down the corridor. At 58, Harrington was the department's crown jewel, a quantum physicist with 3 major international awards and a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. Unfortunately, that reputation wasn't limited to his academic achievements. "Dr. Harrington, I've been working on this for weeks." A student's trembling voice was quickly cut off. "And in those weeks, you've managed to demonstrate nothing but incompetence," Harrington sneered, throwing a stack of papers across his desk. This approach wouldn't impress a first-year undergraduate, let alone solve one of quantum mechanics' most challenging paradoxes. Zoe Rivera, 26, a brilliant graduate student who had turned down MIT and Caltech to work with the famous Dr. Harrington, fought back tears as she gathered her scattered equations from the floor. She had spent countless sleepless nights on this project, fueled by coffee and determination. "I'm sorry, Dr. Harrington. I'll start over with a different approach." "See that you do? And perhaps consider whether theoretical physics is truly your calling," Harrington said dismissively, turning back to his computer. "This quantum entanglement problem has stumped the best minds in the field for months. I expected better from someone in my program." As Zoe hurried from the office, clutching her rejected work to her chest, she nearly collided with Theo and his cleaning cart. "Whoa there," Theo said softly, steadying her with a gentle hand. "You okay?" Zoe quickly wiped away a tear, embarrassed to be seen in such a state. But something about Theo's kind eyes made her pause. Unlike most people who worked or studied here, Theo always acknowledged her with a smile or nod when they passed in the halls. "Just another Friday evening with the great Dr. Harrington," she said with a weak attempt at humor. "He thinks I'm wasting his time with my approach to the Hamilton-Renwick quantum entanglement problem." Theo's eyes flickered with something, recognition, perhaps, but he simply nodded sympathetically. "Sometimes the greatest minds are the least kind," he offered, resuming his mopping. "Don't let him dim your light." Zoe noticed something unusual about Theo's cleaning cart. Tucked between bottles of industrial cleaner was a worn copy of Advanced Principles of Quantum Mechanics, not typical janitor reading material. "You're interested in physics?" she asked, genuinely curious. Theo shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. "Just something to pass the time. I like to understand the world I'm cleaning." Before Zoe could inquire further, Harrington's door swung open again. The professor emerged, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour, his expensive wool blazer a stark contrast to Theo's faded blue uniform. "Ah, Rivera still here?" I expect a completely new approach on my desk by Monday morning, Harrington announced, not bothering to lower his voice. The Hamilton-Renwick problem is likely unsolvable with traditional methods, but that's hardly an excuse for the elementary mistakes in your work. His eyes finally registered Theo's presence, narrowing slightly. Jackson, the second-floor men's room needs attention. Someone was sick in there earlier. Without waiting for a response, Harrington strode toward the department's conference room, where a small gathering of visiting physicists awaited him. More people to impress with his brilliance and intimidate with his arrogance. Zoe watched him go, then turned back to Theo with an apologetic smile. Sorry about that. He treats everyone like they're beneath him. No need to apologize for him, Theo replied, his voice carrying an unexpected weight. I've been cleaning up after Professor Harrington for a long time now. Something in his tone made Zoe look at him more carefully. Have you always been interested in physics, Theo? The janitor's eyes met hers for a moment before looking away. In another life, perhaps, he said enigmatically. But I should get to that mess upstairs. Good luck with your project, Ms. Rivera. As he pushed his cart toward the elevator, Zoe couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Theo Jackson than met the eye. Later that night, with most of the building empty, Theo finished his usual cleaning rounds. The physics department was peaceful at this hour, just the soft hum of equipment and the occasional beep from laboratories running overnight experiments. Instead of heading home, Theo moved quietly to room 305, a smaller classroom rarely used for anything but overflow lectures. He flipped on a single light and pulled a small notebook from his pocket. For the next hour, his mop and bucket sat forgotten in the corner as his hands flew across the whiteboard, filling it with complex equations and diagrams. Had anyone seen him, they would have been struck by the transformation. Gone was the quiet, unassuming janitor, replaced by someone who commanded the mathematical symbols with the confidence of a maestro conducting an orchestra. His eyes were sharp with concentration, his movements precise and purposeful. The Hamilton-Renwick quantum entanglement problem had indeed stumped the field's top researchers for months. What most people didn't know, what Harrington himself didn't know, was that Theo had been working on it too, in stolen moments between cleaning toilets and emptying trash cans. Theo stepped back from the board, studying his work with a critical eye. He was close to something, a solution that approached the problem from an entirely different angle. If his calculations were correct, the implications would be significant. But he needed more time, more quiet evenings like this one. A noise in the hallway startled him. Quickly, Theo erased his work, leaving only a few innocuous-looking equations in the corner of the board. By the time the security guard passed by the room, Theo was mopping the floor, just another janitor working late. The following Monday, Professor Harrington was in an even fouler mood than usual. The weekend conference had not gone well. Several of his peers had questioned his latest paper, suggesting his approach was fundamentally flawed. To make matters worse, the Hamilton-Renwick problem continued to resist his efforts, making him increasingly frustrated with anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. Incompetence surrounds me, he muttered, storming into the department's main office where the administrative assistant, Beatrice Wong, 34, was sorting mail. Good morning to you too, Professor, Beatrice replied dryly, immune to his moods after 5 years of working with him. Your coffee is on your desk, and Dean Foster wants to see you about the department budget when you have a moment. Harrington grunted in acknowledgement, snatching his mail from her hands. Tell the dean I'm busy advancing human knowledge, not counting paperclips. As he turned to leave, Zoe Rivera appeared in the doorway, a fresh stack of papers in her hands. Her eyes were underlined by dark circles, evidence of a weekend spent entirely on reworking her approach to the entanglement problem. Dr. Harrington, I've completed the revisions, she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. I believe I've addressed all your concerns. Harrington barely glanced at her work before tucking it under his arm. We'll see about that, Rivera. Don't get your hopes up. He brushed past her without another word, leaving Zoe standing in the doorway. Beatrice gave her a sympathetic look. One day, someone's going to give that man a taste of his own medicine, Beatrice said once Harrington was out of earshot. And I hope I'm here to see it. Zoe managed a small smile. Sometimes I wonder why I wanted to work with him so badly. His papers are brilliant, but the man himself is a nightmare, Beatrice finished for her. You're not the first student to learn that lesson the hard way. Just between us, his last research assistant transferred to Princeton rather than spend another semester with him. As they spoke, Theo entered with his cleaning cart, nodding politely to both women as he began emptying the office trash bins. "Morning, Theo," Beatrice greeted warmly. Unlike most faculty members, the administrative staff treated the maintenance workers with respect. "How was your weekend?" "Quiet," Theo replied with a small smile. "Just the way I like it." Zoe noticed that the physics book she'd spotted on Friday was gone from his cart, replaced by a different volume, Quantum Field Theory in Curved Spacetime. Definitely not light reading. "Theo, that book you're reading," she began, but was interrupted by a commotion from down the hall. "Who has been using my classroom?" Harrington's voice boomed, causing all three of them to flinch. Heavy footsteps approached, and the professor appeared in the doorway, face flushed with anger. "Someone has been using room 305, writing on MY boards." Beatrice raised an eyebrow. "Room 305 isn't your personal classroom, Professor. It's a departmental resource." "That's beside the point," Harrington snapped. "Someone has been working on quantum equations in there. Equations related to MY research. I want to know who." His eyes swept the room, landing on Zoe. "Was it you, Rivera? Trying to impress me with some late-night breakthrough?" Before Zoe could defend herself, Theo spoke up quietly. "I cleaned that room last night, Professor. I erased all the boards myself." Harrington's attention shifted to the janitor, seeing him, truly seeing him, for perhaps the first time in years. His eyes narrowed. "You," he said slowly. "You erased the boards. But did you see who was writing on them?" Theo's face remained impassive. "No, sir. The room was empty when I got there." Something about Theo's calm demeanor seemed to aggravate Harrington further. For a moment, a strange expression crossed his face, almost like recognition, quickly replaced by dismissal. "Well, whoever it is, they need to stop. That classroom is now off limits to anyone without explicit permission from me," Harrington declared. "I won't have anonymous amateurs meddling in complex theoretical work they couldn't possibly understand." With that, he stalked back to his office, slamming the door behind him. Beatrice let out a low whistle. "What's got him more worked up than usual?" "The Hamilton-Renwick problem," Zoe explained. "He's been obsessed with solving it before anyone else. It could mean another major award if he cracks it. Or maybe," Theo said quietly, almost to himself, "he's afraid someone else will solve it first." Both women looked at him curiously, but Theo had already returned to his cleaning, his face once again assuming the neutral expression of someone who witnessed everything but said nothing. The invisible man who moved through the halls of academia, watching and waiting. What neither Beatrice nor Zoe could have guessed was just how significant that quiet observation would prove to be. The wheels of fate had begun turning, bringing Theo Jackson and Lawrence Harrington toward an inevitable collision course. One that would shake the foundations of Westfield University's prestigious physics department and reveal truths long buried beneath layers of academic pretense and stolen glory. And it all began with a few equations on a whiteboard, the first domino in a sequence that would topple the carefully constructed facade of the department's most celebrated professor. The following evening, Professor Lawrence Harrington worked late in his office, surrounded by stacks of research papers and multiple empty coffee cups. The Hamilton-Renwick quantum entanglement problem had consumed his thoughts entirely, driving him to stay long after his colleagues had departed. His frustration mounted with each failed attempt to crack the mathematical puzzle that had become his obsession. What bothered him most wasn't just the challenge. It was the whispers he'd heard at the weekend conference. Younger physicists suggesting that perhaps the great Lawrence Harrington was past his prime, that perhaps the field had moved beyond him. Harrington's grip tightened around his pen until his knuckles whitened. He refused to become irrelevant. This problem would cement his legacy. He just needed more time. The sound of a cleaning cart passing his office door reminded him that he wasn't alone in the building. Something about the janitor, Theo Jackson, had been nagging at him all day. There was something familiar about the man, though Harrington couldn't place it. Not that it mattered. Janitors were background noise, nothing more. Deciding he needed a change of scenery, Harrington gathered his notes and headed toward classroom 305. Despite his decree that it was off-limits, he found himself drawn to the room where the mysterious equations had appeared. Perhaps the space would offer fresh inspiration. As he turned the corner toward the classroom, Harrington froze. Through the partially open door, he could see Theo Jackson standing before the whiteboard. But the janitor wasn't cleaning, he was writing. His hand moved confidently across the surface, leaving behind a trail of complex mathematical notations that Harrington immediately recognized as related to the Hamilton-Renwick problem. For several seconds, Harrington stood transfixed, watching Theo work with the fluidity of a seasoned physicist. The janitor muttered to himself as he wrote, crossing out failed approaches and developing new ones with remarkable speed. It was the work of someone who didn't just understand quantum mechanics. It was the work of someone who lived and breathed it. Rage and disbelief surged through Harrington. He shoved the door open with enough force to slam it against the wall. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded. Theo spun around, his expression shifting from deep concentration to something unreadable as he faced the professor. He made no attempt to hide the equations behind him. "Good evening, Professor Harrington," Theo said calmly. "I was just playing scientist." Harrington spat, advancing into the room. "Is this your idea of a joke? Mocking real physicists by scribbling nonsense on university property?" Theo's face remained composed despite the verbal assault. "It's not nonsense, Professor." Something in Theo's quiet confidence inflamed Harrington further. He stepped closer, examining the equations on the board. To his growing horror, not only were they not nonsense, they were brilliant. Approaches he'd never considered, mathematical leaps that he himself hadn't made. "This is my research area," Harrington hissed. "You have no right. Mathematics belongs to no one," Theo replied softly. "The universe speaks in numbers to anyone willing to listen." Harrington's eyes narrowed as he studied Theo's face more carefully. A distant memory stirred, a young physicist at a conference years ago. A promising newcomer who had challenged one of Harrington's early theories. "Who are you really?" Harrington demanded. No janitor could understand this level of quantum mathematics. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Theo's face, something like sad amusement. "You don't remember me, do you, Professor? I'm not surprised. People like me have always been invisible to people like you." Before Harrington could respond, the sound of voices in the hallway interrupted them. A group of graduate students, including Zoe Rivera, were passing by, having just finished a late study session. Seeing the confrontation through the open door, they paused uncertainly. Harrington suddenly saw an opportunity. His academic reputation was at stake. He couldn't allow this janitor to threaten his standing. In an instant, his shock transformed into calculated malice. "Everyone, come in," he called to the students, a cold smile spreading across his face. "Our janitor, Mr. Jackson, here believes he's qualified to solve quantum physics problems that have stumped the world's leading scientists." The students filtered into the room awkwardly, exchanging uncomfortable glances. Zoe's eyes moved between Theo and the equations on the board, widening in realization. "Dr. Harrington, maybe we should," she began, but the professor cut her off. No, I insist. This is an educational opportunity." Harrington's voice dripped with theatrical condescension. "Mr. Jackson apparently believes he's smarter than all of us with our PhDs and years of research experience." Theo remained silent, his eyes meeting Zoe's briefly before returning to Harrington. "In fact," Harrington continued, his voice rising, "I think we should put this to the test. Mr. Jackson, since you're so interested in playing with equations that are far beyond your education level, why don't we see what you're really capable of?" The professor turned to the whiteboard, erasing Theo's work with vicious swipes of the eraser, ignoring the gasps from several students who had recognized the brilliance in those equations. He then wrote a complex formula in the center of the board, the core of the Hamilton-Renwick problem. "This," Harrington announced to the room, "is the problem that has stumped the finest minds in quantum physics for months. Mr. Jackson, our janitor, apparently thinks he can solve it while emptying trash cans." The room had grown painfully silent. Even students loyal to Harrington were shifting uncomfortably at the public humiliation of the quiet janitor who had always treated them with kindness. "Professor," Zoe interjected again, "this isn't appropriate." "What isn't appropriate?" Harrington thundered. "Is an uneducated maintenance worker wasting university resources and pretending to be a scientist?" He turned back to Theo, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You are a janitor, Mr. Jackson. A janitor. Nothing more." Something flashed in Theo's eyes then, not anger, but a deep resolve that momentarily unsettled Harrington. "You know what?" Harrington said loudly, addressing the room again. "Let's make this interesting. Tomorrow at 3 p.m. in the main lecture hall, Mr. Jackson will attempt to solve this problem in front of the entire physics department. If he can't, which of course he can't, he'll be reported to administration for misuse of university property and time theft." The students murmured in shock. Harrington was essentially threatening Theo's job, his livelihood, over a mathematical equation. "And if I solve it?" Theo asked quietly. Harrington laughed, the sound harsh and dismissive. "If by some miracle you solve it, I'll personally recommend you for a research position. But we both know that won't happen, don't we?" He leaned closer to Theo, lowering his voice so only the janitor could hear. "Know your place, Jackson. People like you don't belong in academia. You're a waste of potential, cleaning up after your betters when you could have been something. But you weren't good enough, were you?" For the briefest moment, Theo's calm facade cracked, revealing a flash of old pain. It was exactly the reaction Harrington had hoped for. "Tomorrow, 3 p.m., Harrington repeated loudly, gathering his papers. "I'll make sure everyone is there to witness it." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Jackson, don't bother coming in early tomorrow. I've instructed security to keep you out of the building until the afternoon. Wouldn't want you practicing your little hobby on university time." With that parting shot, Harrington swept out of the room, leaving behind a stunned silence. After a moment, the students began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. Only Zoe remained, staring at Theo with newfound understanding. "It was you all along, wasn't it?" she said softly. "The equations I've been finding on boards around the department. They were yours." Theo nodded slightly, already beginning to erase Harrington's challenge from the board. "Why?" she asked. "Why hide this gift?" Theo's hand paused in its motion. "Some gifts come with too high a price, Ms. Rivera. But you could be a brilliant physicist. You." She gestured to the partially erased equations. "You understand this better than anyone I've seen, including Harrington." A sad smile touched Theo's lips. "I was a physicist once. Or trying to be." "What happened?" Instead of answering directly, Theo finished erasing the board and returned to his cleaning cart. "Sometimes life takes unexpected turns. But tomorrow will be interesting." Later that night, in his small apartment on the outskirts of the city, Theo sat at a modest desk covered with papers and notebooks. Unlike his carefully maintained anonymity at the university, his home revealed his true nature. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with advanced texts on physics, mathematics, and philosophy. A small whiteboard hung above his desk, covered in the same elegant equations that had enraged Harrington. Theo opened a worn folder and removed a paper published 15 years earlier in the International Journal of Quantum Physics. The author, Lawrence Harrington. The title, Novel Approaches to Quantum Entanglement Across Nonlinear Spacetime Boundaries. Next to it, he placed his own notes from the same period, notes that predated Harrington's publication by 6 months. The similarities were unmistakable, too unmistakable to be coincidence. Theo closed his eyes, memories washing over him. He had been Theodore Jackson, PhD candidate with a promising future, presenting his research at a conference where Lawrence Harrington had been in attendance. Young, eager Theodore, sharing his ideas with a respected professor who had shown interest in his work. 6 months later, those same ideas appeared in Harrington's groundbreaking paper, the paper that launched his meteoric rise to academic stardom. By then, Theodore had been forced to withdraw from his program to care for his mother, diagnosed with aggressive cancer. By the time she passed away 2 years later, Harrington's theft had become established science, credited entirely to the now famous professor. With no proof besides his original notes and no powerful academic allies, Theodore had eventually accepted a maintenance position at Westfield, the very university where Harrington had built his empire of prestige. It was a cruel twist of fate, but it had given Theo something unexpected: access. Access to continue his research in secret, to use the university's resources after hours, to stay connected to the field that had been stolen from him. For 15 years, he had watched Harrington from the shadows, cleaning his office, emptying his trash, all while continuing his own brilliant work under pseudonyms, publishing occasionally in obscure journals that Harrington would never deign to read. Now The Hamilton-Renwick problem had created an unexpected opportunity. Theo knew he could solve it, had already nearly solved it before Harrington caught him. The question was, after 15 years of invisible existence, was he ready to step back into the light? Theo opened his desk drawer and removed one more item, a USB drive. On it was evidence he had gathered over years, proof of Harrington's plagiarism, not just of his work, but of others. Proof he had never used, choosing peace over revenge. Tomorrow would change everything. Tomorrow, the truth would finally emerge. By 2:30 p.m. the following day, the main lecture hall at Westfield University's physics department was buzzing with activity. Word of the challenge had spread rapidly. Faculty members, graduate students, even undergraduates packed the room, drawn by the spectacle of the department's star professor challenging the janitor to a high-stakes mathematical showdown. Professor Harrington arrived early, looking smugly confident in his tailored suit. He moved through the crowd accepting wishes of good luck as though he, not Theo, would be solving the problem. He had spent the morning briefing Dean Foster, 61, about the situation, carefully framing it as a necessary lesson in academic boundaries. "We can't have maintenance staff playing with expensive equipment and resources," he had explained smoothly. "This will be a teaching moment for everyone." The dean had seemed uncomfortable, but hadn't objected. Harrington's grant money and prestige gave him considerable influence over administrative decisions. At precisely 2:55 p.m., Theo entered the lecture hall. Gone was the blue maintenance uniform, replaced by simple but dignified slacks and a button-down shirt. A murmur ran through the crowd at this transformation. Many had never seen him in anything but his work clothes. Harrington's smug smile faltered slightly before reasserting itself. "Ah, Mr. Jackson, how kind of you to join us. New clothes won't make you a physicist, I'm afraid." Theo said nothing, his calm demeanor unshaken by the taunt. He simply nodded politely and took his position near the whiteboard at the front of the hall. At 3 o'clock, Harrington stepped forward to address the packed room. "Colleagues, students, we're gathered for what I consider an important lesson in academic integrity and the value of proper credentials," he began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "Mr. Jackson here, who normally cleans our facilities, has been caught repeatedly using departmental resources to pursue amateur interests in physics." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some faces showed disapproval, not of Theo, but of Harrington's obvious attempt at public humiliation. "To settle this matter once and for all," Harrington continued, "I've challenged Mr. Jackson to solve a problem that has stumped the world's leading physicists for months, the Hamilton-Renwick quantum entanglement paradox." He turned to the whiteboard and wrote out the complex equation, adding several constraints that made it even more challenging than the version he'd presented the night before. "Mr. Jackson has 30 minutes to solve this," Harrington announced with a satisfied smile, "after which I think we can all agree that some boundaries need to be respected." He turned to Theo, extending a marker with exaggerated politeness. "Your time begins now, Mr. Jackson." The room fell silent as Theo accepted the marker. For a moment, he simply stood there, studying the equation on the board. Then, to everyone's surprise, he turned to face the audience. "Before I begin," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "I think there's something you should all know." Harrington's expression darkened. "The challenge is to solve the equation, not give a speech." Theo continued as if he hadn't heard. 15 years ago, I was Theo Jackson, PhD candidate at MIT, specializing in quantum field theory. Some of the older faculty might remember a paper I presented at the Berkeley Symposium on Quantum Mechanics. A few gasps and murmurs came from the senior faculty. Professor Diana Wells, 67, leaned forward in her seat, recognition dawning on her face. "I remember that paper. It was brilliant. But then you disappeared from the field entirely." "I had to withdraw to care for my mother," Theo explained. "She was diagnosed with terminal cancer shortly after the symposium. By the time she passed away 2 years later, my research had been repurposed." His eyes found Harrington, who had gone very still. "This is ridiculous," Harrington interrupted, his voice strained. "Your time is running, Jackson." "Yes, it is," Theo agreed calmly. 15 years running, to be exact. With that, he turned to the board and began to write. His hand moved with confident precision, adding symbols and equations at a pace that left the audience breathless. Unlike Harrington's showy demonstrations, Theo worked with quiet efficiency, each step building logically on the last. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The room remained utterly silent except for the sound of the marker against the whiteboard. Even Harrington seemed transfixed, his face growing increasingly pale as he followed Theo's work. At precisely 12 minutes and 27 seconds, Theo placed the cap back on the marker and stepped away from the board. "The solution," he said simply. The crowd erupted in murmurs as professors and graduate students leaned forward, examining his work. Professor Wells was the first to speak. It's correct," she announced, her voice filled with awe. "He solved it. And not just solved it. He's developed an entirely new framework for approaching quantum entanglement across dimensional boundaries." Zoe Rivera, sitting in the front row, was on her feet, her face lit with excitement. "This goes beyond the Hamilton-Renwick problem. This could revolutionize our entire understanding of quantum communications." As the implications of what they were witnessing dawned on the crowd, excitement rippled through the lecture hall. Students began taking photos of the board. Professors huddled in small groups, discussing the ramifications of Theo's solution. Only Harrington remained frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. But Theo wasn't finished. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice cutting through the excited chatter. From his pocket, he removed the USB drive. "This contains evidence that Professor Harrington's breakthrough paper from 15 years ago, the one that launched his career, was plagiarized from my original research presented at the Berkeley Symposium." The room fell silent once more. "That's a lie." Harrington finally found his voice, face flushing with anger and fear. "This is absurd. He's trying to discredit me because I exposed him as a fraud." "Am I a fraud, Professor?" Theo asked quietly, gesturing to the solved equation behind him. "Or are you?" At that moment, the lecture hall doors opened, and University President Dr. Olivia Washington entered, followed by Dean Foster. Their unexpected arrival sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd. "What timing?" Theo remarked. "Dr. Washington, I believe you received my email this morning?" The president nodded gravely. "I did, Mr. Jackson, along with copies of your original research notes and timestamp documentation." Harrington's face drained of all color. "This is a setup. You can't possibly believe. I've also been in contact with the editors of 3 journals where Professor Harrington has published," Dr. Washington continued, addressing the room rather than Harrington directly. "They've agreed to conduct a thorough review of his submissions against Mr. Jackson's original work." She turned to Theo with genuine respect in her eyes. "And I must add, Mr. Jackson, that your solution to the Hamilton-Renwick problem is being hailed as brilliant by everyone I've consulted. The Nobel Committee has already been in touch." The shock that rippled through the room at this announcement was palpable. Harrington looked as though he might collapse. "This isn't possible," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "You're just a janitor." Theo looked at him directly, years of silenced truth behind his eyes. "No, Professor Harrington, I was never just a janitor. I was always the physicist you pretended to be." The lecture hall erupted into chaos. Students were on their feet, professors huddled in intense discussion, and camera phones captured every moment of Professor Harrington's undoing. At the center of it all stood Theo Jackson, still calm despite the storm swirling around him. "This is preposterous," Harrington shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. "One solved equation doesn't prove anything about events from 15 years ago." He lunged toward the whiteboard, arm outstretched to erase Theo's elegant solution, but several students moved to block his path. Zoe Rivera stepped forward, positioning herself between the professor and the board. "Don't you dare," she said firmly. Dr. Washington's authoritative voice cut through the commotion. "Professor Harrington, I suggest you step back and consider your actions very carefully." Security cameras in the corners of the lecture hall blinked silently, recording everything. Harrington noticed them and froze, suddenly aware that his every move was being documented. "This isn't just about one equation or one paper," Dr. Washington continued, addressing the room. "This morning, I received a comprehensive file from Mr. Jackson containing evidence of systematic plagiarism spanning Professor Harrington's entire career." She turned to Theo with a question in her eyes. "What I don't understand is why you waited 15 years to come forward." The room quieted as everyone awaited his answer. Theo's gaze swept across the faces watching him, students hungry for justice, professors reassessing everything they thought they knew, and Harrington, whose arrogance had finally been stripped away to reveal the fraud beneath. "I chose peace," Theo said simply. "My mother needed me, and fighting an established professor would have consumed what little time we had left together. After she passed, I had lost my position, my momentum in the field." Professor Harrington was already celebrated, his reputation seemingly untouchable. He paused, his eyes finding Zoe in the crowd. "But then I started seeing young researchers, brilliant minds, being crushed under the same arrogance that had taken my work. When I saw Ms. Rivera in tears after being berated for her approach to the Hamilton-Renwick problem, an approach that was actually on the right track, I realized that my silence wasn't bringing peace. It was enabling harm." Dr. Washington nodded solemnly. "The university will be conducting a full investigation into all of Professor Harrington's published works. In the meantime, he is suspended from teaching and research duties, effective immediately." Harrington's face contorted with rage. "You can't do this. Do you know how much grant money I bring to this university? How many awards? You need me." "What this university needs," Dr. Washington replied coolly, "is integrity. Something you appear to have forgotten long ago." As security personnel arrived to escort Harrington from the hall, he made one last desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. "This man is nobody, a janitor with delusions of grandeur. I am Lawrence Harrington." His voice echoed through the suddenly silent room. No one moved to support him. No one spoke in his defense. The empire built on stolen ideas was crumbling before everyone's eyes. "Your name is all you have left," Theo said quietly. "And it's not even the name your work deserves." As Harrington was led away, his perfectly tailored suit couldn't mask the defeat in his posture. 15 years of living a lie had ended in 12 minutes and 27 seconds, the exact time it had taken Theo to solve what Harrington could not. 3 months later, the physics department of Westfield University had undergone a transformation. The scandal had made national news, with academic journals worldwide reviewing their publication practices. 3 of Harrington's major awards had been rescinded, and his tenure had been revoked following the university's investigation. In the main lecture hall, the same one where Harrington had fallen, a new professor stood before a packed audience of students. Professor Theo Jackson, now dressed in a casual blazer rather than a janitor's uniform, wrote equations on the board with the same quiet confidence he had always possessed. "Quantum mechanics teaches us that observation changes reality," he told his rapt audience. "Today, we'll explore how our perspectives shape what we believe is possible." In the front row, Zoe Rivera watched her new mentor with admiration. As his research assistant, she was helping develop the revolutionary framework that had emerged from his solution to the Hamilton-Renwick problem. Their paper, soon to be published in Science, was already being hailed as a potential Nobel Prize contender. After class, as students filed out, Dr. Washington appeared at the lecture hall door. "Professor Jackson," she greeted him warmly. "I have news. The Theo Jackson Scholarship for Underprivileged Scientists has been fully funded. Starting next fall, 5 students who might otherwise be unable to pursue physics will join our program." Theo smiled, a genuine expression of joy that had once been rare on his face. "Thank you, Dr. Washington. That means more to me than any academic recognition." "Speaking of recognition," she continued, "the Nobel Committee has been in touch again. It's looking promising for next year." Theo nodded acknowledgement, but his mind was already elsewhere. The real prize was returning to the work I love. As they walked together through the hallways where Theo had once pushed a cleaning cart, Dr. Washington asked the question many had wondered. "Do you ever regret those 15 years?" Theo considered this as they passed the janitor who had taken his place, a young woman whom Theo always greeted by name. "They weren't wasted years," he said finally. "I learned perspective, humility. I saw this institution from angles most professors never experience." He paused by a window overlooking the campus. "And I discovered that true brilliance doesn't need arrogance to shine. Sometimes, it's brightest when it emerges from the shadows." Across campus, a solitary figure watched the physics building from a distance. Lawrence Harrington, his reputation in tatters, clutched a newspaper featuring Theo's latest breakthrough. For a moment, bitterness clouded his eyes, but then, unexpectedly, something like acceptance crossed his face. "Some lessons come too late," but they come nonetheless. As Harrington turned away, the weight of 15 years of lies lifted from his shoulders. He would never again be the celebrated professor he had pretended to be, but perhaps now he could become something more valuable, honest. Back in the physics department, Theo Jackson prepared for his next class, surrounded by eager minds hungry for knowledge. On his desk sat a framed photograph of his mother, her proud smile preserved forever, witnessing the triumph her son had finally achieved. Justice had been delayed, but in the end, it had not been denied. And in the hallways of Westfield University, a new legend was born. The janitor who had solved an impossible problem and cleaned up more than just classrooms along the way.